roar of the crowd, the flashing lights, and the aura of invincibility defined Ronda Rousey's reign as the queen of the UFC. She was a fighter unlike any the sport had seen before, a woman who seemed untouchable inside the octagon. To the world, she was unstoppable, a fighter who could end a match in under a minute, a champion whose dominance looked absolute. Yet behind the highlight reels and championship belts was a story she kept hidden for years. A story that reveals a very different side of the UFC, one that she claims ultimately forced her out of the sport she once ruled. Rousey's journey was never one of privilege. Born into a family where toughness was ingrained, her mother, Anne Maria de Mars, was the first American woman to win a world judo championship. That example of grit and determination became the foundation for Ronda's life. But tragedy struck early. When she was just 8 years old, her father died by suicide after a long battle with chronic back pain. The loss left scars that shaped her resilience, but also instilled in her a relentless drive to succeed. She grew up battling challenges that would have broken others. A speech impediment made communication difficult, leaving her feeling like an outsider. But where others saw weakness, Rousey found fuel. By her teenage years, judo had become her escape and her weapon. Through punishing training sessions and relentless competition, she carved out a name for herself on the world stage. That journey culminated in 2008 when she became the first American woman to ever win an Olympic medal in judo, claiming bronze in Beijing. For most athletes, that would have been the pinnacle. But for Rousey, it was only the beginning. When she transitioned into MMA, the sport had no idea what was coming. She wasn't just good, she was terrifying. In Strikeforce, she tore through opponents with ruthless efficiency, her signature arm bars leaving fighters writhing in pain before crowds could even settle into their seats. Fans weren't just impressed, they were stunned. Rousey had the look, the swagger, and the aura of inevitability. For promoters, she was a dream. For opponents, a nightmare. It wasn't long before Dana White, who once infamously declared that women would never fight in the UFC, changed his mind. In 2012, he signed Rousey, making her the first female fighter in UFC history. Overnight, she became the face of women's MMA, breaking barriers and rewriting the history of combat sports. Her UFC debut in 2013 was everything fans had hoped for. Another brutal armbar finish, another first-round victory. The legend of Ronda Rousey was officially born. What followed was nothing short of historic. 12 straight victories, most of them finished in less than a minute. She wasn't just winning fights, she was demolishing opponents. Pay-per-view numbers skyrocketed. Rousey graced magazine covers, appeared on talk shows, and even landed roles in Hollywood blockbusters. She wasn't simply an athlete anymore. She was a cultural icon, the face of a revolution in women's sports. But while the world saw triumph, behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding. The more successful she became, the more control the UFC exerted over her career. Every interview was scripted. Every photo shoot was planned. Every fight announcement was tied to corporate sponsorships and promotional deals. To the outside world, Rousey was the fearless champion. Inside the machine, she was a carefully curated product. The physical demands of her career were brutal enough. Years of judo had already left her body worn down, and the transition to MMA only added to the strain. Torn ligaments, knee injuries, and concussions began to pile up. Training camps became grueling battles of survival, but the UFC machine didn't slow down. Rousey was expected to fight, to promote, to smile, and to sell pay-per-views, no matter what was happening behind the curtain. Friends and training partners noticed the toll it was taking. She became more guarded, less willing to play the smiling poster child. Conversations about her frustrations with UFC executives began to surface. Whispers of conflicts over sponsorships, disagreements over fight schedules, and disputes about her public image started to leak out. Insiders claimed there was an unwritten rule within the organization: fall in line with corporate expectations or risk being sidelined. For years, Rousey navigated these waters carefully. She complied just enough to keep the machine running, while quietly resisting where she could. But when she began to openly question the system, the walls started closing in. One of the most explosive issues centered around sponsorships. The UFC, after its multi-billion-dollar sale to WME IMG in 2016, became even more focused on maximizing profits. Fighters were expected to appear in promotions for corporate partners, sometimes even when it conflicted with their personal deals. According to those close to Rousey, she refused to endorse certain products, including a controversial energy drink heavily backed by UFC executives. That decision sparked tension. Whispers began circulating about her loyalty. Stories leaked to the media questioning her dedication, suggesting she was distracted or that her training wasn't what it once was. To Rousey, it felt coordinated, a reminder that the UFC's promotional machine could just as easily tear her down as it had built her up. By late 2016, the pressure reached a boiling point. Meetings with UFC executives reportedly became heated. At one point, Rousey confronted Dana White directly, telling him she wouldn't be a mouthpiece for brands she didn't respect. His alleged response was blunt. In the UFC, you're either all in or you're out. For Rousey, it was a thinly veiled threat, a reminder of the power the organization held over its fighters. When she returned to fight Amanda Nunes at UFC 207, the cracks were already showing. Publicly, the UFC billed the fight as one of the biggest events in MMA history, Rousey's redemption arc. Privately, insiders say the organization had already moved on. Promotional materials featured Nunes more heavily than Rousey, a stark contrast to her past dominance of the spotlight. Even her walkout was the subject of behind-the-scenes disputes over which sponsors would be visible. The fight itself was short and devastating. Nunes overwhelmed Rousey in just 48 seconds, handing her a crushing defeat that shocked the MMA world. But what stood out most was what happened after. Instead of protecting their star, the UFC seemed to highlight her downfall. Commentary emphasized the end of her reign, and the promotional machine quickly pivoted to its new champion. For Rousey, it was clear. The UFC had decided she was expendable. In the months that followed, offers for new fights came her way, but with conditions attached. Contracts were laced with sponsorship obligations, scripted interviews, and demands that went beyond fighting. Financial incentives were tied not only to her performance, but to her willingness to comply. Training facility access was delayed. Promotional shoots were canceled. Media inquiries were quietly redirected. To Rousey, it was a campaign of soft pressure, designed to break her will without ever putting the demands in writing. The final straw came when she was told her next fight, if she wanted one, would be buried on a card beneath fighters she had once headlined over. To her, it was deliberate humiliation, a way to diminish her brand and make her exit look like a personal choice rather than a calculated push. In her words, the fights they wanted to give her weren't about competition. They were about control. By early 2017, Rousey had walked away. She didn't hold a dramatic retirement press conference. She didn't let the UFC control her final moment. Instead, she quietly exited, leaving fans to wonder what really happened. For years, she deflected questions with vague answers about wanting new challenges. But eventually, the truth came out. In a candid interview, Rousey revealed the scandal she had kept buried. According to her, the UFC operated on a system of compliance and silence. Fighters who aligned with corporate interests were rewarded with favorable matchups, better pay-per-view points, and media protection. Those who resisted were quietly punished, rankings manipulated, opportunities withheld, and reputations damaged through coordinated leaks to the press. The most explosive part of her confession centered on fighter safety. She alleged that the UFC had pressured fighters, including herself, to downplay serious injuries to keep main events intact. In one instance, she claimed she was told outright that pulling out of a fight would cause irreparable harm to her standing, regardless of the medical risks. For Rousey, this wasn't just unethical, it was dangerous. Her revelation sent shockwaves through the MMA world. Some fighters backed her claims, speaking in vague but supportive terms. Others stayed silent, fearing repercussions. The UFC denied the allegations, dismissing them as disappointing comments from a former star. But the whispers didn't go away. Fans began to see other fighters' sudden declines, mysterious absences, and media narratives in a new light. After leaving the UFC, Rousey found new success in WWE, where her star power once again brought mainstream attention. Hollywood roles followed, keeping her in the public eye. But no matter where she went, the shadow of her UFC exit lingered. To some, she was a trailblazer who exposed the dark side of a billion-dollar industry. To others, she was a bitter former champion, unwilling to accept the natural decline of her career. Her legacy, however, is undeniable. She will always be remembered as the fighter who broke barriers, the first woman to headline a UFC event, the first female champion in the organization, and the one who brought women's MMA into the mainstream. But she will also be remembered as the fighter who dared to speak out, who pulled back the curtain on a system that, if her claims are true, thrives on silence and compliance. For Rousey, the decision to walk away wasn't just about defeat. It was about reclaiming her freedom. In her eyes, staying would have meant surrendering her voice, her values, and her autonomy. Walking away was the only way to win a fight that no one else could see. And years later, as her words continue to spark debate, one question still lingers in the minds of fans and fighters alike. How much of the UFC's glittering success was built not just on talent and skill, but on the silencing of its stars?